Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome on this rather cold morning to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of the webinar today is the balancing of support with challenge during the current COVID situation and the lockdown that we've just gone into this morning. And obviously we're coming at that from the perspective of governors. Just a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces before we kick off proper, and that if you haven't already located the go-to toolbar, there'll be a little orange rectangle with a white arrow in it somewhere floating around in the top right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on that, that will enable you to open the toolbar, and that will just stay in the right-hand side of your screen for you. On the toolbar, you'll find the little document icon. If you click on that at any stage now, during the webinar or immediately afterwards, you can actually download a copy of the slides that we're going to be sharing with you today. You'll also find on there a little box with questions written in it. If you have any questions or comments at all during the webinar today, and we please encourage you to make this as interactive a session as you possibly can by asking questions or commenting, just scribble them in there and hit the send button, and they'll appear in front of us, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to them. We may, just because of the sheer volume of governors and those involved with governance that we have on the session this morning, not be able to attribute all of the questions, so we'll probably try and group them together if that's okay. But if we don't manage to answer your question during the session, we will get back to you electronically following the webinar later during the day. And last but by no means least, hopefully you can all see the toolbar now. If you can also locate the little hand icon on there, just by way of a little sound test, if you could click on that, if you can hear me, and just to indicate that, that would be great. That's lovely. I can see everybody's hands going up now, so that's fantastic. I'll put your hand down for you to save you the effort of doing that. And with no more ado, we will kick off. As I say, a very warm welcome to this webinar this morning, and please do ask questions, make comments as we're actually going through. My name is Steve Barker, and together with Linda Waghorn, we are here from Better Governor, and we're delighted to work in partnership with Governors for Schools. And it's me on the left-hand side of the screen, of course, and Linda is on the right, and Linda's on the other end of the line. Hi there, Linda.
Good morning.
And as I say, together we will actually guide you through this this session this morning. Linda's going to be taking a leading part in it, and I will chip in from time to time and talk to a couple of the slides, but I'll be managing the questions as we go through the session this morning. So with no more ado, I'll hand over to Linda.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is a session that is largely driven by the request we had from you to include something around understanding what governors or governance should be doing during this period of the pandemic. So it's the conversation started, if you like, when schools were closed and were only open to small numbers of pupils. For some of you, that was a bigger problem in terms of managing expectations at school, but it is fair to say that many staff at the early part of the pandemic were as anxious as the rest of the community and were anxious in the run-up to coming back to school. So what does it look like now, particularly today as we go into a second lockdown? And we couldn't have predicted that when we were putting this session together. But what does it mean for our governance function when we are providing support to the school, because our role is support and challenge? How do we provide that support in a meaningful way whilst not getting overly involved in the operational day-to-day activities that are going on when they have increased so much as a result of the infection controls and the new routines and processes that have been put in place? So we're going to unpick that in the first part of the session. And then the contrast to that is that from the 1st of September, the expectation is that governance picks up the functions that are rightfully placed in its hands. And we have, during the school closure period of time, were given very clear instructions from the DfE that we were to take an urgent and time-bound decision-making approach. And that now, with a return to school on the 1st of September, we need to unpick what that looks like. So how do we operate as governors while still holding those functions and balancing that against that support for schools. So that's what we're going to look at today, and hopefully we'll answer some of those questions as we go along with our presentation. But if not, please feel free to ask those questions as we go through the various slides. So first of all, let's have a little think about what work was being done around the issue of workload. So we know from the data that the DFE collect that there are teacher shortages around the country, and they may be very relevant to you in your school or academy at the moment. But the DFE sought to help us to think about this, given that the areas on the right-hand side of this slide, all of these things were things that teachers reported back made their workload more difficult, took away the time from actual teaching children, the reason they joined the profession, and started to impact on their workload. And for many, it was a reason why they left the profession. So there was already a focus, and the new Ofsted framework designed in 2019 was looking, when it was making inspections to schools, at what schools had done to reduce workload. So this, hopefully, some of these things were already in your governance mind as a school before the pandemic started. So if we think that these were the problems before, if we look at the those in the pink, outlined in pink on the left-hand side of this screen, all of these things have increased the workload for schools even further. So having to prepare and be ready to provide remote learning. And just a reminder here, remote learning doesn't mean it has to be entirely online. Remote is just not when you've got children in front of you, and there are lots of different approaches. Online will be part of that. Keeping those bubbles, not mixing with each other, staff not mixing with other staff, a whole range of things around bubble integrity, and managing different routines for pupils in the classroom, no matter how big the bubble size. And in some secondary schools, the bubble size is quite large. Thinking about all of those different hygiene regimes, and many school staff are having to manage cleaning within their own classroom during the day. The different routines for staggered start and finish times. Many secondary schools are operating in different classrooms so that they can keep whole year groups in a particular part of a building, and then not having children mixing in the school dining hall and managing supervision of children over break time. So all of these things, and this isn't an exhaustive list, there will be others, these have all increased the amount of workload for staff, and we've still got some staff who are very anxious and stressed about being with children, and we've got a lockdown that started today, but schools are still open. So again, some of these things will have increase. So this is the backdrop to why we need to think a little bit more carefully about how we support schools in a meaningful way whilst all of this is going on. So there is something called a common law duty of care. So if we think about what this looks like, so this is the for all staff, so not only teaching staff but all staff, we are responsible as governors for ensuring that, so not the doing, not the operational day-to-day, but that common duty of care, we need to make sure the school is taking all steps which are reasonably possible to, one, ensure health and safety is in place, and we have probably talked quite a lot about that in our governing body meetings, but also what are we doing about well-being, the concern for the physical and mental health of our employees. And we can see from that previous slide, it is very easy to see that excessive pressures or demands are being made on staff in schools. And under the Health and Safety at Work Act, again, there is a need here to think about those work-related issues and make sure that we are keeping staff healthy and safe. So it's that's doubling up of the duty. I'm going to hand back to Steve now, because we need to think about this from that operational day-to-day level and who's in charge of making sure these things happen.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, and I think it's just fair to say, as a sort of a bit of a backdrop to this slide, that many of us, perhaps in governance, if we're new to governance, or perhaps we've been involved for some time, we may not actually be as aware of the Headteacher Standards as perhaps we are of things like the Teachers' Pay and Conditions document, the Teachers' Standards, etc., which are the backdrop to contracts for teachers in school. Now, this is not a statutory document. It is one that has literally just been republished in September this year, but it does provide a very helpful outline of what the national expectations are. As I say, they're not enshrined in law, but it is intended to actually be good practice. And similarly to the teacher standards, which outline what the expectations are of all teachers, this does split it into the various sections of the role of head teacher or senior leaders of schools, and talk specifically under this area of organisational management, which is one of those subheadings that we've got identified on this slide, of some of the things that are expected of our head teachers. And again, the reason for including this today is just to perhaps encourage us as governors to actually hold the mirror up ourselves and say, well, what part do we play in this? How are we ensuring that whilst head teachers have to do this for other staff, we're there actually doing the same for them and ensuring that this is actually happening on a school-wide basis? So we've got things very much sort of following on from what Linda said on that previous slide in terms of the Health and Safety at Work Act, but this idea of ensuring that pupils but also staff are safe and are protected, and that the school has effective safeguarding in place as part of that general duty of care. Now, duty of care is something that I think we've been mindful of over the past few years. We've had various initiatives like the Workforce Challenge, dedicated headship time, obviously teacher workload, and that includes head teachers, has actually very much been in focus for the last 2 years or so. But all of these factors have been enshrined in law for quite some time here. As Linda says, common law as far as duty of care is concerned, but Health and Safety at Work Act does have a reach into this, there's no doubt about that at all. And you will see, if you look at the more detailed view of these standards, that there is a backdrop here to not just what the expectations on what head teachers should be doing in terms of setting up that internal structure, that internal operational platform for the school itself, but then our role as governors in actually monitoring that to see that that's done. And of course, the idea of these standards is that they should be overlaid with that appraisal or performance management process for head teachers and very much form part of those objectives that we're actually setting on an annual basis. Again, mindful of the situation that we're in at the moment in terms of COVID and the extra demands that are being made on head teachers and other senior leaders' time, but particularly for new head teachers, very helpful in terms of thinking about job profiles, and there is no reason at all why job profiles cannot be revisited. It's always sensible to have HR advice if you're doing that, but if you have a head teacher or principal or executive head teacher in post in your school or your trust, when was the last time their job profile or job description was actually reviewed? And is that perhaps not in line with the reality of the role now? But of course, our major emphasis today is not about the compliance aspect of this. It's more about the imperative, the moral imperative for us as governors to ensure that we are picking up on some of these issues of care, the duty of care that is, and having regard for not just the statutory element of our role, but actually that imperative that we know that workload is not causing issues as far as well-being and mental health are concerned. Then, in terms of what that might look like on perhaps a more practical basis, there are things that we can do, and again, this isn't intended to be patronising in any way whatsoever, and you may think it does look a little bit teaching grandmother to suck eggs here, but some of the things that can be done to actually improve well-being of staff, to we're not going to solve, we don't have the magic wand to be able to solve the workload issues. We can perhaps influence them as governors through the questions that we ask and some of the suggestions that we might make. But there are some things that school can actually do. There are things that we can physically do ourselves as governors in normal times. And this is just a list of, I think, some of those areas that come under the general banner of recognition that, but actually do make, little things mean a lot is actually, I think, the mentality behind this. And the simple act of saying thank you. I speak to head teachers every day of my working life, and the number of head teachers I've spoken to since September who, somewhat disappointingly say, do you know, not a single governor has actually been in contact to say thank you, or that meeting that we had, nobody said thank you for everything that's going on in the school at the moment. And the very act that, the very act of saying thank you to anybody, it does, even on an internal basis, give us an inward smile. It does actually give you a little lift and makes you feel a little bit better about yourselves. The idea of delivering tea and coffee, obviously governors aren't allowed in schools at the moment, but teachers being stuck in bubbles at the moment, is anybody in school doing that? I have to say there's a little bit of a personal interest in here. My wife is a school teacher. My wife goes from probably about 10 to 8 in the morning until gone 4:30 in the afternoon without actually leaving her classroom. So she rarely has lunch. She certainly doesn't get tea or coffee anymore. It would be quite nice if somebody actually thought to do something like that. And I know in one of the schools where I'm a governor, the head teacher has actually mobilised staff to actually recognise that, and from time to time in those the staff room bubbles that exist, donuts on a Friday, etc. All of those sorts of things do make a difference. Sorry, I didn't mean to turn the screen forward then. Here we go. And again, recognition. I mean, Star of the Week is something that colleagues in primary schools will be very familiar with. The idea here is that actually, why don't you have a Star of the Week for members of staff as well? It doesn't have to be just teachers, of course it doesn't. But if somebody goes above and beyond, and I think all of us have to be mindful that probably every single adult working in a school at the moment is doing things that are not in their job description. They are going way above and beyond the normal expectations just to keep schools safe, just to keep schools ticking over, to maintain the integrity of those bubbles at the moment. And that's vitally important. And I think as governors, we do need to recognise that. And maybe if governors actually started a Star of the Week, or if there's a system going in the school, maybe the chair of governors sends one to the head teacher, but if they're aware that something above and beyond has happened that week. One of the schools where I'm chair, the principal decided in the lockdown in the summer that if somebody had done something worthy of some praise, not only did they get a postcard from the principal saying thank you, they got a little packet of sunflower seeds. Now, sunflower seeds aren't cheap, I have to say, as somebody who actually grows sunflowers, but nonetheless, that was actually quite a nice little gesture, but actually cost very little, but actually paid dividends just in terms of the goodwill that generated and that feel-good factor that it nurtured amongst staff. And even having these discussions, do we know as governors that discussions are taking place in staff meetings, if some of those are being held virtually in schools anyway, but just getting all members of staff, teachers, non-teaching staff, all members of staff, just to think about, well, what is it to look after yourself at the moment? What do you do? What can you do to improve your own well-being and mental health at this point in time? Because self-preservation is hugely important, particularly during these periods of relatively high stress and anxiety, which we are undoubtedly in at the moment. And of course, above all else, just demonstrating that duty of care. Just keeping in contact, and we'll talk about perhaps some suggestions on how to do that to keep the pressure down on staff. But if you are linked to, let's say you're a safeguarding governor and you're linked to the designated safeguarding lead, just keeping in touch and saying, how are you, as opposed to, can you do this for me, can you do that for me? That's demonstrating that duty of care. It is just recognizing that we're in difficult times at the moment. The work of governance goes on, but actually the nicer side of governance, the friendly face of governance, is really important as well.
And I think that maybe some of these things feel incredibly operational, and Stevie's talking here from his experience as a governor, and hopefully you can find a pattern there in your governance. Yes, I know what's happening in my school because some of it I've participated in, some of it has been talked about. But here it is about really saying, what do you know about wellbeing approaches in your school or academy at the moment? Have you talked about it? Do you know what is happening? And we'll look at that a little bit more as we go through. We're not expecting that some of these things are your role as governors, but to be aware of what is happening to manage wellbeing. For example, that encouraging self-preservation, there are some partnership organisations with the DfE that have provided some very good resources that schools can make available to their staff via that approach. So it is about developing an understanding and knowing what's available.
Just got a couple of questions coming through before we move on, folks. Question here from Chris, and Chris is actually saying, and we're going back to the Headteacher Standards here, the standard that referred to ensuring staff are deployed and managed well with due attention paid to workload. Chris is saying, does this refer to the head teacher as well? The point that we were making, Chris, was that yes, you're absolutely right, because Chris goes on to say that head teachers are taking on a lot of additional responsibility themselves, and maybe staff don't necessarily know about that. That's where I think the role of governance comes in. Head teachers are, for the most part, very effective team leaders, and team leaders, of course, tend to lead their teams by adopting an approach in many cases that says, well, I won't ask you to do anything I won't do myself. So an awful lot of things, and Linda's going to come on and talk about these a little bit later, so I don't want to steal her thunder, but there are lots of things going on in schools at the moment, and I think if you like, our driver in actually putting those head teacher standards up there for you this morning is really just to make you aware of what the expectations are, yes, of head teachers, but actually what expectations should there be on us as governors to actually make sure that everything that the head teacher does in terms of that well-being, that workload and everything else for staff, that we're taking a similar view, because we do have that duty of care for all staff, and of course that does include the head teacher.
And we will have had an opportunity this term through our head teacher appraisal committee to ask those questions in a very personal and relevant way. So hopefully you have chosen a good team of governors to do that, and they have addressed in that appraisal process, in that duty of care, work-life balance, and they could have used the new standards in order to test that out and maybe set something up to make sure that they are not only looking after their staff, but they are also looking after themselves.
Yeah. A couple of other quick questions before we move on, Linda, and I'll hand back to you. Imogen, amongst others, is actually asking, there's several on this theme at the moment, be useful to know what the expectations are on governors now in terms of spending time in school again. Certainly our view and the advice that we're giving to anybody that asks us is that common sense should be the rule here. Certainly as of today, it would not be appropriate, but we've been saying to governors, we do not believe it's appropriate for governors to hold meetings in school at the moment. We do not believe it's appropriate for governors to go into school. Schools have done a lot of really hard work to maintain the integrity of those bubbles they've set up, and for any visitors to go in potentially compromises that. So we're just saying to people, look, from a health and safety perspective, think of the implications. Yes, it would be great, it would be far easier for an awful lot of us to go back into school, but it probably isn't terribly sensible right now.
And I will pick that up again in a later slide.
Indeed. Back to you, Linda.
Okay, so just a couple of quick slides here as to setting the strategic agenda for governance. As I said earlier, we are working in an environment before the pandemic where the DfE was conscious of the workload of staff and had published some guidance around workload reduction, which you may already be aware of, but if not, then this is a practical in-school approach and gives a whole range of different suggestions, including all sorts of things around marking and some of those things that teachers themselves had said increase their workload exponentially. So that's the first piece of work that is going on, and when we return to Ofsted inspection, there will be some questioning around what the school has done to reduce workload, although quite how that's going to fit in with what we're currently going through is a little bit difficult to judge at the moment. But just be aware that there are these things in place, and that sits as a backdrop to some of what we're talking about. And then the second document that we're working with as governors is the Governance Handbook. And what we're talking about in the Governance Handbook, if we can move on to the next slide, Steve, is all of our responsibilities as governors in the section for compliance. So staffing comes under our compliance duties. We've got all of those duties under employment and equalities. And as we've demonstrated with the slides that we've shared with you already, this is an ensuring that the school is compliant with these duties, including that care duty, and most of those responsibilities for staff are with the head teacher on an operational basis, but the responsibility for the head teacher is with us as governors, because we're either co-employers with the local authority if we maintain schools, or we are actually as a board the employers of staff, including the head teacher. So we need to take those responsibilities seriously. So let's have a little look at what, as governors, as board members, we need to think about in terms of our role here. And this is directly from the handbook. And we need to see some evidence, have some conversation, be aware of, collect information about the work-life balance of teachers and the executive leadership of our organisations. So if we're trustees in a multi-academy trust, we're looking then at a wider group of people in those schools. How do we collect that information? And we need to have that due regard for the well-being and mental health of those school leadership team first, because if they are not looked after in the first instance, they are unable to do that piece of work for the staff more broadly. So is this something where we've got a specific piece of work going on in relation to the work-life management? And certainly in one of the schools where I'm a governor, that was a particular part of the strand of the school development plan. And we did have somebody leading on well-being. And that then has kicked up further pieces of work during the pandemic. So this is our role, and it's about whether we've been aware of and actively participating in the delivery of this area of compliance, and being careful that we are collecting information and we understand what is actually happening in our schools. So if we move on, we're just thinking here about what we've said already and what is happening and how much information we've received. So first of all, is there some recognition and some acknowledgement, either in a meeting or independently? You might be a chair of governors, you might have had conversations with the head, you might be part of the head teacher appraisal committee. So first of all, we need to recognise that the head teacher's workload has increased, and particularly if you're in a small school, it is only you who maybe has that movement around school in quite the same complete way than anybody else on the staff. How much information do we actually need as a board to be strategic? Because our focus on the initial school closures drove us into a much more operational way of being. When we're looking at risk assessments and infection controls, that's all very operational. So now we've moved back to a full function. How much information do we actually need to keep that strategic focus? We're not the day-to-day managers of the school. Our operation virtually means that we're likely to have quite extensive amounts of reading, and that means we've got to be more prepared, because to actively participate in a virtual way, you need to put in some research and reading time. You need to be prepared to ask those questions because you haven't got the face-to-face in-person approaches that are available to you. So there's a little bit more work for governors themselves to do. And then thinking about, and we'll come on to talk in a little bit more detail about monitoring visits, because that's been raised by some people already. If we did things a certain way in the past, if we met as a committee, is there a way that we might do this differently? If we want some more information, is that information already available? Could we research that before? Have we been given this information somewhere else? Is it on the website? So how might we do some things differently, given that we don't want to increase the workload any further from where it is currently? We're just going to pause for a moment for you to reflect a little bit, and we're going to run a short poll on this, how much we know really about what's been going on or is happening in our own schools and academies. So Steve's going to launch that poll.
And that should be up on your screens now, folks. So you've got the question in front of you. You know, which of these has actually been discussed at your board or governing body since March this year? If you have any difficulty accessing the vote in terms of actually submitting your vote, just try minimizing your screen for a moment, and that should free up the voting panel and enable you to cast your vote. Okay, we've got just over half of you have voted now, so we'll leave the poll open just for a few more moments to actually give you that opportunity. That's lovely, we're up to 75% now. Okay, we're up to very nearly 90% of you, so if you'd like to vote, please do so now, folks. We are going to close that poll down in just a few moments, and we'll share the results with you then. Okay, we're just about there, so I'm going to close the poll now, and I will share those results, and they should be up in front of you now, Linda.
And I'm quite encouraged, considering the number of people we've got on this webinar this morning, that is a high number of people that have actually discussed at board level workload and teacher hours, and that is, as we would hope, a piece of good practice. And almost all of you have talked about staff wellbeing and mental health. So again, that suggests that for most of you there are materials, there is information for self-help within your schools, and that head teachers have particularly been aware of and addressed their staff concerns and provided support for that. I think the only thing I would add to that is just make sure it has included the head teacher as well, because they're very good in the most part at the doing, but not necessarily the reflecting how this impacts on themselves. Staff surveys, yes, since March that has been difficult, but almost half of you are saying that you have relied on some kind of survey of staff to get some feedback. And this is important, isn't it? And it may be in a very much more reduced way, because we don't want to increase the workload further. So we're not necessarily only talking about that Ofsted-driven staff survey that might be an annual feature of our school or academy lifestyle, but it might have been a very simple 1, 2 or 3 question survey that staff have received as part of that wellbeing provision and mental health check-in. So it's about the voice of and consultation being real and effective in your school. So staff surveys, checking in, ensuring that there is a voice of staff, because it is unlikely that your staff are all gathering together in person in the same place. So the feedback that normally would have been conversational in those kind of meetings might need to be unpicked a little bit more in order to get that voice alive and working within your school environment. The employee assistant program, it might be called something else in your school, but this really is access to and it's usually a bought-in program under a service level agreement, but it gives staff access to counselling, debt management, and a whole range of other things confidentially without any information going back to the school or academy. But it has been a real lifeline for some members of staff in some very difficult circumstances. So again, this might be something, even with your finance hat on, that you're aware that the school buys, have staff being made aware that that is available to them. And then, Steve, some other workload support suggestions that may have come up in the question box.
Yeah, we've got quite a number. I'll whistle through them as quickly as I can. We've got Stella is saying they've discussed teachers who are covering for colleagues who might be shielding. Marian's saying that in her school they've limited the policies that are being reviewed to those which are considered absolutely necessary. France is saying we've redeployed senior management team to cover post of staff well-being. Moira is saying support for shielding staff and also support for staff returning to work, perhaps after absences. Another Marion is actually being very generous and buying chocolates for staff and thank you cards. Investing in counselling is coming from Sarah. Again, that's something personally I know is actually happening in a number of schools at the moment, which I think linked to that employee assistance programme that Linda just mentioned. Rachel is saying that in her school they've looked at extending some temporary TA contracts to provide some additional support. And again, obviously for the catch-up premium, that might be something that schools want to use that particular funding stream to do if there are funding pressures elsewhere. Charlene is saying that none of those things have actually been discussed in her school. So maybe a few things to actually take back with you there in terms of some prompts, Charlene. SLT working a day a week at home on a rota basis during the first lockdown is a suggestion that's come from Carol in her school. And I think that's probably about it. We've got quite a few of those are repeated from other colleagues. So if I haven't given you a name check on those folks, apologies, but we've got quite a lot of people on the call this morning.
And one of my schools, some small multi-academy trusts, they have down tools at 4 o'clock on a Friday. So they make sure that staff go home at 4 o'clock on a Friday because obviously the workload has increased and people and pupils are still getting very tired at the end of a busy week. So the contrast here has been, and thank you for your suggestions and shared information there. That's all been incredibly helpful. And we're going to move into talking about the contrast here between that support and the return to operating against our key functions of governance in the autumn term, and how we still keep the focus on support, but we also return to particularly this middle area here. And apologies, I've just spotted a spelling mistake that jumped straight out at me when I'm looking at it again. So ensuring that the head teacher performs their responsibilities and that we hold the head to account for the educational performance of the school and the finances of the school. So we're moving back to that, or we have moved back to that function of governance that says we now need to see some evidence that these things are happening. We are now holding you to account for that, but we are doing that alongside the understanding and acknowledgement that the workload in school has increased, and we're trying to do this in a way that, yes, demonstrates that we are challenging, we are asking questions, we are confirming and ensuring, but also we are taking governance seriously. We have got children back in school that have missed school. For some of them have missed 6 months of school, and we are making sure that the school is doing all it can in order to support the education of those pupils. So let's look at what we would normally be doing in the autumn period of time. So from September to December, these should be on our agenda. Some of them you will have already managed in your meetings effectively, or will continue to manage on a monitoring basis. Others, you may use it a little bit as a checklist that these are things that you haven't yet talked about, but you will need to have talked about before the end of the autumn term. So the first one, annually, we generally have a new Keeping Children Safe in Education document for September. We did this year, and there are some new expectations about what should be happening in schools, and it is on the governing board to ensure that staff have been trained, staff understand what the new expectations are, and that they are being delivered and complied with in school. So that's both an introduction and training checklist, where's the evidence that that's happened, and a continually monitoring that these expectations are being met. There is something, and if you've joined us before, we've talked about recovery curriculum before. It is not a thing, but it is that period of time where as children were returning to school, their learning was being assessed, their mental health and well-being was being assessed, and gaps in either identified and support built into that curriculum that is being taught and delivered to those pupils. So we globally have coined this term recovery curriculum, but we need to understand what's happening and how that's happening in our schools and academies, and what the support is that sits behind that. From the 30th of September, every school had to be ready to deliver remote learning. So again, do we know what our school has done? What would happen if a pupil or a bubble was not in school because they were self-isolating? What have we done to make sure that the school is ready to deliver? As I said before, that doesn't necessarily mean entirely online. It might be a mixture of a variety of different things. There is a duty to deliver the new relationship, sex and health education curriculum. Many schools were ready to deliver that in September. We have a slight extension to the full curriculum for this subject being in place by the end of the spring term next year, but many schools have readjusted that mental health and well-being element of that curriculum in response to their recovery curriculum and children returning to school. What's happening about school development plan? Normally we would, as governing body, be approving that plan in September. However, with 6 months of a very different educational offer, many schools are delaying their planning to slightly later in this term. However, if there were certain areas of weakness identified in the past, it is unlikely that those areas will have gained in strength over the time of closure. Excuse me. And therefore, we should, as governors, be asking, in the absence of a fully formed plan, what are we doing about those areas where we already knew we needed to work harder, or we were putting some effort into addressing particular issues? Staffing and pay. Again, autumn term is when we have our pay committees, when appraisal for staff should have taken place, should have been completed by the 31st of October in most places. Has this happened? Have reports come back to the governing body, or are those on your agenda for your next meetings? And not only because of the pandemic, but has been influenced by the pandemic, our financial monitoring. In most cases, in almost all cases, we will have spent more money on putting the infection controls in place. What impact does some of this and the lack of the reduction in income through lettings and various other things that we would normally be doing, what impact is that having on our school finances? So these are the sorts of things that would be exercising and feeding into your agenda and are part of that return to that full function of governance. Any questions before I move on from that slide, Steve?
Well, a couple of interesting suggestions coming through, actually. Beverly's put a comment on to say that in her school they've actually decided to extend the school development plan, so they've got a 2-year SDP, and that includes the recovery curriculum, and one assumes that governor monitoring is actually linked to that.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of how the recovery curriculum has fed into and informed their school development plan. So I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah, we've got a couple. Francis has just added they've got a 2-year SDP in their school as well. Yeah, that's not at all uncommon, as we say. Elaine's got a nice idea here that they've actually in her school got a wellbeing champion in the school. It's not a member of SLT or even a middle leader, but it's actually having a very positive impact on staff. And they're now thinking about there needing to have a link, a governor actually associated with that role. And I think that's increasingly we are seeing that coming up in quite a few schools, aren't we, Linda?
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience.
We've got some very specific questions coming through here about funding, etc., which is sort of a little bit off-piste this morning, but we'll throw them up anyway. Marion's asking if most schools have actually received their COVID-19 extra funding yet. I think the simple answer is that if you're an academy, you probably have. If you're a maintained school, the money has actually been passported to local authorities, and they are required to actually distribute it to schools during the month of November. So it will be happening if it hasn't already, Marion. And Mervyn is saying, will the government pay all COVID-19 cleaning costs? The simple answer there is no, they won't. Again, the amount of money that they're reimbursing was only for that period between March and July. There is no indication or guarantee that they'll pay anything extra on that at all. And also they have looked at the balances that some schools have had. So if schools have had a positive carry forward, then they are actually making adjustments on what schools can and cannot claim, is my understanding. I think, let me just double check. Well, we've got one here, Linda. I think you may be covering this in a few moments anyway, but Nicholas is asking, how do you suggest we ensure the curriculum is well taught whilst we can't go into school and without adding to pressure on teachers?
Okay, yeah, I will come to that, I promise.
Exactly. Okay, but other than that, no, you're good to go.
Okay, so let's think about monitoring, because that question is leading us very nicely into governor monitoring. And first think about what happens in the time when we are not living through a pandemic, when we're not prevented from going into school from some very obvious infection control aspects. Because in normal times, 80% of what we do, our monitoring, is done remotely, is done through receiving information and it feeding into the discussions that we have at board meetings. So those things continue. And what sort of things are we thinking about that are included in this 80%? Well, I've given a little bit of a list on the next slide. Again, not an exhaustive list. You may be doing some of these things in a different way or in addition to this, and that's absolutely fine. But we have a variety of reports that we would normally be receiving in advance of our meetings. Those continue. Head teacher, safeguarding, send reports. If we've got looked after children in our school, we'll be receiving reports and information about them. We are receiving and receive data on attendance, might be part of the head teacher's report or an attendance officer's report, but data about, information about how we're assessing, how the recovery curriculum is throwing up information that we are then using as governors. We are and have seen and continue to revise the risk assessments in school and the infection control measures that have been put in place. We should have received and continue to receive curriculum information. So if, for example, one of our areas, let's take that suggestion of the 2-year school plan, excuse me, and let's say that this was an area around science, for example, and we're extending our school plan. We have got some pupils, let's take a secondary example, who are going to be sitting their GCSEs and A-levels next year. We've got a need to focus some understanding of gaps and support, and we would therefore need to understand how the curriculum in science is being adjusted. If we're thinking about relationship, sex, health, education, in any area from the very youngest children to the end of secondary school, we might be getting some information about how that curriculum is being shaped, designed and implemented, and what potential impact that is likely to have. So we're still receiving that information, and although we might not have a subject specialist giving us a presentation, they might present a report in advance that we might ask questions about in a virtual meeting with their attendance for part of that meeting in a virtual way. There is still an expectation we get those financial monitoring reports and what we complete our budget work. So that should still be happening. And we've heard examples of policies that have had their review period extended, but things, for example, like safeguarding policies and the risk assessments and the procedures, those things would still need to be factored in as regular parts of our oversight, and we would be receiving those policies to review and ask questions about. So 80% of what we do is remote anyway. So let's have a look at how we might think about doing the 20% a slightly different way. And again, this is not prescriptive. This is offered as a suggestion of a sort of 4-step approach that we might have. And it starts with identifying where we are already. So this might be with your link, or it might be as part of your responsibility for keeping in touch, or your school development plan linked group of individuals. So first of all, we're saying, what does the school know in this area? So let's take that science example. Where are we? What do we know? Well, we know we've had children out of school and they're going to be going into an exam setting, and we need to do some work to make sure that they're properly prepared. How does the school know? Well, we've done some analysis. Now those children have returned from school, we've identified what those gaps are, and then we follow that up with the actions the school are going to take. What's the school done? Well, we've made assessments. What's the school planning? This is how we're going to approach that, and different students will have different needs, and so we need to look at, we're making sure that we're understanding how that meets all of those different needs, including those with SEND or those who have disadvantage or part of our vulnerable groups. And then our monitoring is about, given the stage of the year that we're at now, has there been any impact so far? And it may be that we've only done the first 2 things in school so far. So what's happened so far, and what is the impact so far, and what do we hope that the impact will be as we move forward through the rest of the academic year? Now, having done this piece of work, and we can do this remotely, I'm going to share some ideas for how that might happen. But at the end of that process of monitoring, there must be a written report back to the full governing body, because what we're doing by improving our individual knowledge is, through the report, informing the collective knowledge of the whole board. So we are sharing what we have learnt with the whole board. So collectively as a board, we are all better informed. We are all able to understand what's happening and how it is being measured. So one of the things that we might do is, and Steve alluded to this earlier, you may already have a link. So for example, in one of my schools, I am the early years link. In another school, I'm a staffing link, but let's take the early years example. And I am linked with the early years lead at that school. And this would work with a school development plan subject link, a safeguarding link, or any kind of approach that you as a governing board, and it may be that as a board you'll need to drill down and decide who, if it's not obvious, which link you have or you need to work through. But a conversation, either virtually, on the telephone, in a Zoom call, or another kind of platform call. But the first thing is that support one, is that well-being. How are you? Nice to talk to you again. And then, having established that rapport and understanding, and acknowledged and recognised the difficulties that may have presented to that member of staff, we're then into the what have you learnt about, and that links directly back to that 4-step approach on that previous slide. So what have you learnt about early years as children have returned to school? What are the main challenges and barriers that those pupils have faced as they've returned to school? And particularly with early years, those children were only just beginning to understand what routines looked like and how behaviour in a group was expected to be. So again, it's about understanding that, what actions has the school taken, and what are we anticipating will be the outcomes. And in my particular academy, we are expected, the head teacher is expecting us to link twice during the autumn term with that member of staff that we're linked to. But again, it's about establishing a framework that is both governance in real time, but also is not adding to the workload of the school. So it might be that in your school or academy, you're doing something like this once this term because that has been deemed to be what suits your school environment and the workload environment where you are at the moment.
And I think it's worth saying that as with all things governance, context is everything, of course. So if you're a governor in a very small school, then you might have to have a discussion at for the governing board, but also with the head teacher about have teachers actually got time to have these discussions, and when's the most appropriate time to schedule those. Because in primary schools, of course, not only have head teachers have got the responsibility of wearing a multitude of different hats, there are fewer people to share the responsibilities with, but also each of those teachers may have a multitude of different subject and aspect responsibilities, and finding time on top of all of the additional responsibilities at the moment to have a scheduled conversation with the governor, no matter how positive our intentions are in terms of well-being, etc., there is a balancing act to be had here. And I think what Linda and I are saying is that yes, the normal business of governance has to go on, but we have to temper that with a balance of what's the reality in schools at this point in time. And we certainly don't want our well-intentioned actions, as they might be as governors, to be the straw that breaks the camel's back on this one.
Absolutely. And if I go back to the poll that we ran, the approach that I have in the example that I just shared with you was discussed at a board meeting at the beginning of term about what would be in the best interest of both the school and the board. And we designed that together in partnership with the head teacher. And the head teacher was very keen that monitoring should continue. Other examples are screen sharing. If, for example, even with a single central record, which is usually electronic, screen sharing with the school business manager or whoever is in school day-to-day responsible for the single central record can make that available. Having little live video clips shared with you from your link person in school. Again, all of these things are possible. And there isn't a barrier here to thinking imaginatively and creatively, but it is about also reflecting on, is this something that the school has got the capacity? And those individual members of staff may not have the capacity because they're picking up all sorts of other things as well to be able to do this. So there's some good ideas to discuss, but at the end of that discussion, it should be an approach that fits and meets the needs of the school. So it's that balancing, isn't it? We would like to monitor. How might we do it best in the current circumstances? No monitoring at all is not acceptable. Monitoring that increases the workload to an extent that is unacceptable to the school from a workload and well-being and mental health point of view, again, is the other end of that. And we're trying to find a way. I'm not going to use the word compromise because I don't think it is a compromise. It is about balancing what is possible, what is desirable, and what allows us to get the right information. So just a couple of quick slides, I think, which confirm what Steve and I have just said to you. It's proceed with caution. You know, life is stressful and staff are still anxious, particularly going into the second lockdown. Thinking about our expectations, what's realistic? Are we being realistic? Yes, it may be possible, but is there capacity? Prepare to be flexible. So just because it happens in your workplace, you might be geared up and familiar and experienced. If you're asking a member of staff on top of all the other things to learn something new, a new approach, that might be the straw that potentially could break the camel's back. And then lastly, just reflecting on questions for governors. What should we ask ourselves as governors? Is governance operating strategically? We can just have that last slide up, Steve. That would be really helpful. So have we gone back to that strategic operation? Have we stopped focusing too much on the day-to-day? What steps have we taken as a governing body to reduce those demands on the school? And do we recognise and we discuss that workload and staff wellbeing at our meetings? In the vast majority of cases we do, but we have had one example at least of that conversation maybe not happening at board level. And do we understand what actions the school is taking in its day-to-day operation to understand and manage those workload demands? And we can ask those questions at a board level, along with that discussing the workload and well-being. I'm conscious of the time. We provided links to the resources in that last resource slide for you. If there's any final comments or questions, Steve, do you want to pick those up before we finish?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions that have come through. I mean, just to say thank you very much, everybody, for all of the questions this morning. I'm sorry if we haven't responded individually to all of them. I've tried to respond to quite a few as they've come through on the panel, but we've had a couple of questions, or more than a couple of questions, a number have come through about governor workload and some of the things that we can do to perhaps be aware of the pressures that the current situation is putting on us as governors. Very good point to make, and I think certainly I would say, and I know this is something Linda and I have talked about before, as the chair I try and keep in contact with as many governors as I possibly can. I certainly speak to the clerk on a very regular basis, and I think the bigger the governing body you've got, the more important it is for people to keep in touch with one another. Just encouraging governors who perhaps are not out and about as much as they would want to be, engaging in activities such as this morning, so participating in webinars, keeping their professional development update. That in itself is a good diversion. Workload, I know, has increased for an awful lot of people, but hopefully coming back to the point that Linda made about the DfE guidance, was that governing board meetings, and that includes committee meetings if we have them, should have been focusing on urgent and time-bound business. That mantra doesn't go away. I think we have to ensure, as we've tried to make the point this morning, that our focus has to include all of the things that governance is responsible for, and increasingly we're moving back into perhaps more normalized territory now, albeit we're still doing it remotely. But yeah, there are challenges for everyone in our society at the moment, and I think hopefully what we've tried to do this morning is just raise awareness a little bit about some of those well-being and workload factors and how we do. And it's about balance, really. And I think as governors, we have to think about how we maintain balance in our own lives as well. But certainly, I think from our perspective, all we would like to say to you folks is thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. We look forward to seeing you in the not too distant future at other webinars that we'll be hosting for Governors for Schools. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. The recording of the webinar will be up on the Governors for Schools website in the not too distant future. And enjoy the rest of your days, and please stay healthy and safe. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Goodbye.